Hello again, and welcome to CBA's weekly blog. I'm Patrick Hurd, Principal Consultant at Community Business Australia, and I'm delighted again to be joined by Luke Mountford, Partner at Hopwood Gann. Hello, Luke. Nice to see you again.
Good to see you again, Patrick.
And we're continuing our series of conversations around the not-for-profit sector, the consolidation that's happening, and one of the strategic options around merging acquisition in terms of a sustainable future for our clients. So let's continue that conversation. You mentioned last week in terms of, this strategic approach, or what was the other term you used? A distressed approach that providers can often take. And that leads me to think, well, once they've made that call, what's next? What's next from your perspective?
So a really critical process of any transaction process, Patrick, is the due diligence process. And I might talk about that in a little bit of detail. People often understand that when looking at it from the perspective of a buyer. So if someone's going to go and either purchase an organisation or consolidate with another organisation, people understand it from a buyer's point of view, because as the buyer, you want to know what you're getting yourself into, basically. What are you inheriting when you take on another organisation? But people often don't think about it from the seller's perspective. And it comes back to that sort of concept that we spoke about last week of taking a strategic approach to this type of transaction. So when you're a seller or you're a potential target of an acquisition, what are you thinking about from a due diligence perspective? And in fact, what we're seeing become quite prevalent now with some of our clients is the seller or the target actually getting their advisors to do a due diligence on them before they start letting purchasers have a look at their business. And that might sound a bit strange that you would do a due diligence on your own operations. But again, it goes back to taking that more proactive strategic approach to it, because if you do have a problem sort of sitting or lurking somewhere within your organisation, which is better? Is it better to have a purchaser find that and point that out to you? Or is it better to find that out yourself before anybody else finds out about it and give yourself an opportunity to fix it before anybody else knows that you've got a problem? And I'd put it to you that the answer is pretty obvious. It's the latter. So it's not uncommon through a due diligence process to find problems, whether they're big or small. But the critical thing is, do we have an opportunity to address those problems and fix them before they get to a point where they can jeopardise the transaction?
Gotcha. Yes, I was just smiling to myself, just going through a number of processes where significant components were unearthed late in a due diligence process, which caused a lot of angst, stress and concern to one of the parties. So yes, that more proactive approach would have unearthed that earlier. So give me some examples. What are some of the things that get unearthed that you've seen in your experience?
Well, it really does depend in a lot of cases on the particular type of business, but I'll give you one example, Patrick. So I was working for a client that operated in the education space a few years ago. And obviously in that space, one of the critical assets that business needs in order to be able to continue operate is its intellectual property, particularly the intellectual property in the curriculum for the program that it teaches. And we discovered that we had a problem in the due diligence in that particular scenario, because components of the curriculum were developed not by the employees of that organisation, but by independent contractors. And broadly speaking, when it comes to intellectual property, if your employee develops intellectual property, that belongs to the organisation. But if it's developed by an independent contractor, then initially it will belong to the independent contractor unless there is an agreement in writing to assign that intellectual property to the organisation. And we weren't able to establish that there'd been a valid assignment of that intellectual property in that scenario. So one of the key assets that organisation needed in order to be able to conduct its operations, we couldn't prove the organisation owned it. And that, in fact, resulted in that transaction in that particular instance not proceeding, because we couldn't give the acquirer the comfort that they were looking for, that they were going to be able to continue to operate the business. Now, in practical terms, it was probably very unlikely that those contractors were going to come back and knock on the door and say, I own that intellectual property. But that's the level of detail that we get into in these transactions. And it's really important that you have your house in order and that you can satisfy a potential acquirer or a potential merger partner that the business that you are currently operating has all of the assets that it needs to be able to continue.
Well, it's interesting you use that term, your house in order, and it's a term that I use regularly with clients. particularly if they're being acquired, for example, and they sometimes don't feel motivation to get that house in order because they say, well, we're being acquired, like so. But I say, you've got to make sure you're in the best possible shape you can be to make sure you get the best outcome you're looking for your stakeholders. And so I absolutely agree. I think you're right. You've got to make sure that's all in order. And so I really like that point you raised about the pre due diligence process and self due diligence before you even start that process.
Yep.
Because they start becoming quite expensive exercises, from my experience. Would you agree in terms of once you get down that path?
It can become very expensive, and that's sometimes what puts some people off from doing the process beforehand. They think they're incurring costs that they don't really need to incur. But the reality is, as I say, that cost is going to be well spent if you give yourself opportunity to address or correct issues that a buyer might otherwise find that, as you say, might either put the transaction in jeopardy or lead to a less optimal outcome if they're discovered in the course of a due diligence process undertaken by the buyer.
Right, and that's a nice segue to our conversation next week about how to get our house in order. So I look forward to that. So Luke, thanks again. And if you'd like to know more about how Luke and CBA can assist your organisation, if you're contemplating looking at a merger or acquisition in the future, please contact us at CBA. Until then, bye for now. Thanks, Luke.